New York City is on track to have a socialist mayor. That's after Zohran Mamdani, a 33-year-old Democratic socialist, won the Democratic primary for November's mayoral election. And his victory speech was full of his now trademark charm.
Thank you, my friends. Tonight, we made history. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. My friends, we have done it. I will be your Democratic nominee for the mayor of New York City.
Mamdani's campaign focused on New York's growing affordability crisis, with ordinary New Yorkers increasingly priced out of rents, groceries, and access to amenities. He's pledged city-owned grocery co-ops with price controls, rent freezes in certain buildings, and free bus travel in the city. That focus on tackling the economic woes of ordinary New Yorkers appears to have paid off. With 93% of the votes counted, Mamdani was the clear winner, and with nearly 44% of New York Democrats voting for him. Significantly behind was his main rival, the disgraced former New York governor, Andrew Cuomo. In his concession speech, Cuomo was pretty gracious.
Tonight was not our night. Tonight was Assemblyman Mamdani's night, and he put together a great campaign, and he touched young people and inspired them and moved them and got them to come out and vote. And he really ran a highly impactful campaign. I called him, I congratulated him, I applaud him sincerely for his effort, and let's give him a round of applause and thank him for his campaign.
Now, that was distinctly different in tone from how Mamdani's political and media opponents had attacked him in the build-up to this primary, and because it wasn't Mamdani's economic or social policies that were in the crosshairs, but rather his views on Palestine. In the past, Mamdani had called to globalize the Intifada, as well as chanted from the river to the sea. And that support for Palestine was used as an attack line during his entire campaign. Take a look.
Supporting these Democratic Socialist candidates that released a wave of anti-Semitism throughout our city, which has been toxic.
There's a leading mayoral candidate in New York right now, who refuses to condemn the phrase, globalize the Intifada. That is sickening that this is in our political system.
You're currently the only candidate using the term genocide to describe what's going on in the war between Israel and Hamas. You realize a lot of people stop listening when you use a hot-button term like that.
Do you support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state?
I support Israel's right to exist as a state with equal rights. I believe that every state...
Why not as a Jewish state?
Because I'm not comfortable supporting any state that has a hierarchy of citizenship on the basis of religion or anything else.
Because of Mamdani's support for Palestinians in Gaza, he was forced to repeatedly confront accusations of anti-Semitism, and while being asked more about Israel than any other candidate in the race. Both of the city's major newspapers, the New York Times and the New York Post, each from the opposite side of the political spectrum, condemned his candidacy. But Mamdani was incredibly good at addressing the criticisms, including this week, with fellow candidate Brad Lander on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room, is that there are many people in New York, even people who would support your candidacy otherwise, who don't want to support you because of the Jewish community's fear of the true and rising anti-Semitism, not only around the world, but in this country and shamefully in New York, which is the largest Jewish population of any city other than Tel Aviv in the whole world. And they are worried, they're very upset by some of the things that you've said in the past. And they are afraid that your mayorship would actually lead to increased anti-Semitism, that they believe that that would be more dangerous for them. What do you say to those New Yorkers who are afraid that you wouldn't be their mayor, that you wouldn't protect them?
I know where that fear is coming from. It's a fear that is based upon the horrific attacks we've seen in Washington, D.C., in Boulder, Colorado. It's
all the way from Jews will not replace us to today.
And it's a fear that I hear also from New Yorkers themselves. Just a few days after the horrific war crime of October 7th, a friend of mine told me about how he went to his synagogue for Shabbat services, and he heard the door open behind him, and a tremor went up his spine as he turned around, not knowing who was there and what they meant for him. I spoke to a Jewish man in Williamsburg just months ago who told me that the door he left unlocked for decades is now one that he locks. And ultimately, this is because we're seeing a crisis of anti-Semitism.
Mamdani's Muslim background was also cited by some as a reason not to vote for him in a city with a large Jewish population. On his show, Colbert gave him a chance to address those claims.
You'd be the first Muslim mayor of New York. How do you think you could build a bridge of understanding between the significant Muslim population here in the city and the significant Jewish population here in the city? How do you think you could lower tension?
I think by foregrounding that humanity. And in many ways, that's the most New York City thing we can do, because for so many of us who've grown up in this city, difference is something that we celebrate. It's something that we know is actually a part of the fabric of this place that we call home. And many years ago, I was the campaign manager of a Jewish candidate for state senate, and I took him to a mosque in Bay Ridge. And after he gave his speech at Friday prayers, an older Palestinian man came over to him, and he looked at him and he said, "Cousins." And I think that there is this possibility of building a shared life in our city, because ultimately that is the story of New York City. It's a shared life of people from across the world, and it's one that we know, even in the language of the hostage families themselves, everyone for everyone. We are tied together as one.
Despite facing pretty intense scrutiny for his positions on Palestine and without the support of most of the Democratic establishment, nor Andrew Cuomo's $25 million super PAC and billionaire backers, Mamdani has won the race. But for now, while the New York left is celebrating his win, there are plenty of people unhappy that Mamdani even made it this far. Here's the view of the Murdoch-owned New York Post. NYC SOS reads the headline, and the paper asks, who will save city after radical socialist batters Cuomo in Dem mayoral primary? Meanwhile, radical Zionist movement Betar Worldwide urged all Jews to evacuate NYC while retweeting a post from the Republican Jewish Coalition calling on Jewish people to evacuate the city immediately. I'm joined now by Waleed Shahid, a Democratic strategist. Welcome back to the show. Great to have you on. Let's begin with a general question. How significant was this win?
Yeah, this is one of the biggest political upsets in American history. They're bigger than AOC defeating Joe Crowley in 2018. And, the only comparable thing that I could imagine is Barack Obama beating Hillary Clinton. But, Barack Obama was backed by significantly more forces in the Democratic Party than Zohran Mamdani. I mean, this is a huge victory for the left, for Muslim Americans, for Jewish Americans who have been protesting in the streets for in some cases decades, but most recently in the past year, to stop the Israeli assault on Gaza. And last night, this was just, feelings of jubilation, hope, a vision for the future for both, the Democratic Party and New York City. People are incredibly proud of the discipline and rigor and just the grit of Zohran's campaign and the Democratic Socialists of America and many of the local organizations, Muslim, Jewish, Arab, who supported this campaign against all odds and against over $25 million of super PAC spending from all the way from Palantir to Michael Bloomberg to Trump's donors, Bill Ackman, DoorDash, Uber. This was a major defeat of the Democratic Party establishment and of its aligned donors, and also of a lot of the Trump donors who donate to both corporate conservative Democrats and to Republicans.
But just help us get our expectations in order. So he's won the primary to become New York mayor, but the Democratic candidate is presumably the favorite to win. So should we assume that Mamdani will become New York mayor, or do you think there are going to be, presumably there'll be lots of money piling in to try and stop that happening? How are you interpreting this primary win?
People were very surprised by the tone of Andrew Cuomo's concession speech. It's the most gracious thing I think he's ever done in his political career. His tone was extremely conciliatory. Many of us were afraid that Andrew Cuomo would do as he pledged to do in the primary, is that if he didn't win the Democratic primary, he would run as an independent in the general election. And if that were the case, many people in the Democratic Party establishment might have thrown their support behind him to defeat, a left-wing populist candidate like Zohran Mamdani. It doesn't seem like that's going to be the case anymore, given Cuomo's tone. Many members of the Democratic Party political establishment, from Hakeem Jeffries to Chuck Schumer to Kathy Hochul, have also, as of this morning, said positive, nice things about Zohran. So that would mean the race would primarily be between Zohran Mamdani and now independent, corruption scandal ridden Mayor Eric Adams. Eric Adams is very unpopular in the city. Maybe he could pull a rabbit out of a hat and get, major support from corporate donors, pro-Israel donors, things like this. But it seems very unlikely that will happen at this point. The more likely scenario is Zohran will be the next mayor as of January next year.
I mean, I don't in any way want to say this to underplay Zohran Mamdani's incredible achievement here, but did he get slightly lucky with his opponents? Why the hell did the Democratic establishment all rally behind Andrew Cuomo as the guy that they thought could win? This is a guy who had to resign sort of in disgrace as the governor of New York for sexual harassment, for allegations of sexual harassment, which he of course denies. And you had this sort of very embarrassing series of Democratic politicians who had called for his resignation just 3 years ago and were now saying he was the right guy to lead New York City. What was the Democratic establishment thinking?
Yeah, I don't want to take this victory away from Zohran. This is the Cuomo thing is a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, one of the hardest things to do in American politics is to be a candidate without any name recognition, meaning that voters literally have never heard of you before, because we don't vote in primaries, we don't vote based on parties, we vote based on individuals. And so Zohran started with 1% name recognition, and Cuomo started with nearly 100% name recognition. And so he was strong in some regards, meaning that everyone knew who he was. He had almost every single major labor union in New York City backed him. Most of the elected officials backed Andrew Cuomo. Most of the Democratic Party donors and also, corporate Republican donors backed him. It was not, everything in hindsight seems like it was easy and a disaster, but that's, nowhere. And Zohran really picked up speed in the last 3 weeks. And Cuomo was also virtually endorsed by the New York Times editorial board in the city. So, the reason why the kind of corporate conservative wing of the Democratic Party were not able to field another candidate besides Andrew Cuomo is because of Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo is the closest thing that Democrats have to Donald Trump in their party. He is a vindictive, the closest you can get to anything like an authoritarian. People refer to him in the New York City press as a sociopath, very much like a machine, strongman type. And he has crushed anyone from emerging in the Democratic Party to, even within his own ideological lane, to emerge as a potential successor or someone who could potentially run in that lane that's similar politics to him. He has not allowed, no dissent, no successors. It is about him, ultimately. He's narcissistic, and ultimately for his wing of the party or his ideological faction, he likely committed his own unforced error here by running. But ultimately, even before ideology, politics is about Andrew Cuomo, for Andrew Cuomo.
Let's talk about the role Palestine played in this race, because, what's remarkable about Zohran Mamdani's win is not just that he was someone who, opposed the genocide in Gaza and called it a genocide, which is remarkable in and of itself for someone to win in the United States. But, I mean, his statements, I don't know if he describes himself as an anti-Zionist, but sort of when he answered the question, should Israel be a Jewish state? And he said it should, like all states, I think it should be a state where citizens have equal rights, whatever their ethnicity or background. Those are positions which, I mean, they shouldn't be radical, but I assumed they were radical when it comes to sort of American, sort of the center of gravity when it comes to American political discourse, let's say. So how surprising is it that someone with those positions could win in New York City, which I suppose is not only the center of American capital, but also the city, I think, outside of Israel with the largest Jewish population in the world?
Yeah, there was a deliberate effort by Zohran Mamdani's opponents and also in the New York City political and media establishment to paint Zohran as a anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, extreme Muslim candidate, and to also divide the very real, bonds of solidarity in the city between progressive Jews and progressive Muslims, progressive Arabs, who have been working in electoral politics and community organizing in the city for many years, including people like Brad Lander, the third place candidate who told his voters to rank Zohran Mamdani number 2. Brad Lander is one of the highest, is a Jewish elected official with one of the highest positions in New York City. He's the comptroller, which is essentially like the treasurer or CFO of New York City. And they don't agree on every single point related to Israel-Palestine. But I think forging that bond is so rare in American politics for a Jewish and a Muslim candidate to appear on stage together and support each other with a politics that is more or less, on the same page. A lot of people today in the Democratic Party establishment are saying that, Zohran's candidacy wasn't really about policy or ideology or Palestine even. It was about, he was really good at TikTok. He went on all the podcasts. He represented a young face against an old guard. And I frankly think that is a lot of cope from the Democratic establishment to not grapple with what anyone who was paying attention to that race knows that, those things certainly helped, but they were in service of a larger political project and political vision. And Zohran would probably be the first one to tell you that you cannot tell the story of this campaign without acknowledging that Zohran unleashed a kind of sleeping giant in New York City in the Democratic Party, which has been bottled, which is fierce opposition to U.S. support and the Democratic Party support for Israel's war crimes in Gaza. That has not been able to find a political expression or political vehicle in the Democratic Party, even though most Democrats agree with that position. And I think because of Zohran's history on that issue, his convictions on this issue, and his compelling common sense, humanity-based answers on some of the questions he gets about those issues, that really galvanized his core constituency of volunteers that enabled him to get to where he was today, rather than do what Democrats typically do on the issue, which is say nothing, tiptoe around it, or parrot, AIPAC or even Netanyahu's talking points. And so I think a lot about the 2017 airport protests also when Donald Trump did the Muslim ban in New York City. Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and many Jewish Americans, went to airports. People shut down their bodegas. Many bodegas or corner stores or delis in the city are owned by Arab Americans. People shut down their stores to go protest during the initiation of the Muslim ban by Trump. And those people were carrying around American flags saying, no hate, no fear, no ban. And that particular sentiment that was expressed in 2017 against the Muslim ban, the Democratic Party has worked really hard to exclude that sentiment from being expressed anywhere near formal politics. And while talking a lot of game about how the party is for multiracial democracy while Donald Trump is against it, Zohran kind of unleashed the contradictions around that and kind of enabled it to be weaved together into a real fabric of what solidarity and common humanity might look like across difference. And I think a lot of people really valued that approach to politics, which is refreshing.
And I suppose when he was controlling the narrative, so sort of in his literature, in his videos, Zohran Mamdani was very, very focused on the cost of living. I think sort of when it was his choice, what he spoke about, that's all he ever spoke about. Which I think is important, actually, though. If he was asked about a different thing, he was willing to answer the question. He wasn't like, well, I'm not here to talk about Palestine. I'm here to talk. He was like, I will answer your question, but then I'll move on to this. Very, very talented individual. But in terms of the cost of living, I suppose to make sense of whether this can happen, because obviously he's got some very ambitious pledges. So let's talk about a rent freeze and then also free buses. So these are both, I mean, they sound radical. I suppose it's our audience might not really understand how New York housing works, because you have rent controls, but on only some flats, and the mayor gets to decide whether or not the rent increases. It's a bit confusing for us. So if you could sort of explain how some of these ambitious policies would play out in practice, that would be helpful.
Yeah, my understanding is that the rent stabilization or rent freezing, rent control is controlled by the Rent Guidelines Board, whose members are appointed by the mayor, and they have the power to freeze the rents. I don't know what it's like in London or in the UK, but there was more rent stabilization and rent control in the 60s and 70s than there is today. Many of those rent-controlled apartments have increasingly gone out of rent control due to loopholes that landlords have imposed and the weakening of strong housing policy in the city. It won't be an easy walk in the park. Like, this will be a real fight with landlords in the city around getting that through. There'll be a whole media battle around it. They will probably trot out small mom and pop individual landlords to make their case against rent freezing. On some of the other pieces like grocery stores or free buses, there are some cities in the U.S. that are in Canada that already have free bus programs. Actually, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who was the last progressive mayor of New York City, it's the parallel here is when Bill de Blasio was running for mayor, he campaigned on universal pre-K, and he said he would pay for it through a millionaire's tax. And the New York Times editorial board at the time said that they couldn't endorse Bill de Blasio because his policies were so outlandish and were never going to happen. One of the things about universal pre-K was that it needed to be funded by Albany, the state capital of New York, and Andrew Cuomo was the governor at the time, and Andrew Cuomo hated Bill de Blasio, and Andrew Cuomo didn't want to tax his own millionaire and billionaire donors to pay for the universal pre-K program. But Bill de Blasio put together a major community, labor union, political apparatus to run an entire campaign in the public around shaming Andrew Cuomo as the main blocker to New Yorkers having access to universal pre-K. And eventually Andrew Cuomo relented, and New York City had one of the first universal pre-K programs in the country that now Mamdani wants to increase. So there are models for this. And I wouldn't say that, on some of these things, it'll happen. These things can happen on day one. Like, these are going to be real struggles and fights to get done against some of the most powerful people in New York City, let alone America, let alone the world. But I think that if Zohran can put together the coalition and the inside-outside game that even someone like Bill de Blasio put together for universal pre-K, it's possible. You just have to fight for it.